When Nick approached me about doing this paper, I said to him, I'm a bit out of practice of doing papers. I left as an employed academic from the University of New South Wales 7 years ago. And although I did agree, and after a few days I realised that I knew a vast amount about the NTEU and rather less about Palestine and BDS. So the first thing I did, more or less, was to try and read at least a little bit more about Palestine and BDS that I had known. I might say in relation to BDS, it did have some impact on me. I used to be an infrequenter to Max Brenner, and once there was the demo there, I've never been back since. And the other thing is I live in what was used to be Marrickville Council area, and there was a huge brawl on Marrickville Council about BDS. And even though I was ambivalent about the whole thing, I thought some of the opponents were just appalling in the way they expressed their opposition. So that's about the amount of my experience in this area, and most of what I have to say will be about the NTEU and its foreign policies, and then a bit more about Palestine and BDS. I suppose in the international work of the NTEU there are three things. Expressions of solidarity, they're easy. You write letters, pass motions. You know, there's no drama usually about such things. Involvement in international organisations to do with the activity of the union, in this case the Education International, and development work with other education unions, specifically in the South Pacific, but in other places as well. So the Education International is the main activity for the union internationally. Also, the NTEU is active in the OECD and in UNESCO on primarily education and labour rights matters. It's run issues with the auspices of Education International on issues relevant to women and First Nation members. And also there's been lots of international speakers at National Council meetings. Now, I want to spend probably the bulk of the time talking about how the NTEU has dealt with the issue of Palestine and BDS, but more Palestine generally in this case. And it's an interesting case because the discussions didn't start locally, they actually started internationally in Education International. And I think it was in 2006, although there'd been something written about Palestine by the NTEU in earlier years, it didn't amount to much more than we don't take a position on the matter, which is serious enough, but there wasn't much discussion. At the Education International in 2006, there was a carefully worded statement and a carefully worded resolution on Palestine generally, and with some reference to BDS. Now, you know, international organisations work by consensus, and so it's not surprising that the resolutions in the statement, you know, had 2 bob, 3 bob, 20 drachma each way. But the statement, which I'll show you in a minute, the statement certainly was not reflecting the policy of education unions, particularly in the higher education, who had a much stronger position on not only the issue of Palestine but of BDS. And the University and Colleges Union in the UK was an example of that. And it's relevant because the NTEU is the Australian equivalent of that. Now, this was the reference to violations of rights in the West Bank and Gaza. Resolves to support the work of relevant and independent Israeli, Palestinian international human rights organisations, etc., particularly in relation to the West Bank and Gaza, on the issues of civil liberties, academic freedom and professional rights. I've left a word out there. But then the next one. Acknowledges Israel's rights to adopt appropriate measures consistent with international law to protect the security of its citizens, but insists that the Israeli government allow for free movement of students and staff with occupied Palestinian territories and so on. That was a compromise statement. In fact, the president of Education International said that. And he did say, we've had very careful negotiations, not only with the unions that take a strong position in this area, but we have the agreement of both the Palestinian and Israeli teachers' unions to this statement. So it was clearly a compromise statement. Now, I haven't been able to chase this down, but given subsequent events in Australia, it wouldn't surprise me that that statement showed some influence of Graham McCulloch, the General Secretary of NTU, but I haven't chased that down. What is not said, there's no recommendation or reaction under the official consultation between the relevant unions, and for achieving what is in effect a two-state solution, and there's certainly no commitment to boycott or otherwise isolate Israel. That was in 2006. The matter came up at the National Council of the Union, which should explain, occurs once a year. It deals with the national business of the union, has supporting speakers. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of it's process. And it's rare to have debates about issues because generally the consensus has been worked out beforehand between the movers and seconds of motions, or if the executive gets involved. But this one, there was a motion and a foreshadowed motion which were entirely the opposite. The motion that was moved, and the mover was an executive member, Michael Thompson, who maybe you know to one or two of you are at University of New South Wales. He moved the motion which basically said we should have a discussion which would lead to, after a year, a statement significantly, explicitly supporting BDS as a tactic to be directed towards Israel. And then it goes on, it's quite a lengthy thing. But that's the crucial sentence, the second one. Statement significantly, explicitly supported BDS as a tactic to be directed towards Israel. Now, there was a fairly fiery debate about this. It was brought up by people from RMIT and Melbourne University who were associated with a particular political organisation, but, you know, that's fine. And there was a pretty fierce debate. And the executive motion, on the other hand, was basically we remain neutral on the issue of Palestine and Israel, but we support the Education International resolution, which is slightly more radical than being completely neutral about the matter. It was some process. Anyhow, there was a very long debate. And so you've basically got the power of the executive who had discussed all this before the meeting, got the minutes, and McCulloch was very prominent in the debate, and he basically argued the position of the union for quite some time, we don't have any policy on this. We've not got into that. The original motion was lost by that number, which was not great. I was there, but I'd retired by then, so I didn't have a vote. Could have been 39. But that wasn't bad, given that it sort of came out of the blue, and hadn't been carefully prepared for, in my view. And so, such when the executive motion supporting EI's statement was carried on the voices, with some people voting against. Now, there's a very interesting statement about this in the minutes. There was a lengthy discussion of the complexity and fraught nature of Middle East conflict, an acknowledgement that establishing a formal policy view on the issue was not part of the core business of the union. That's in the minutes. Now, the minutes are signed off by the General Secretary. It's not drafted by him, but the same person who's been drafting them for most of the history of the union, she drafts them, but it's signed off by him. And then I started looking at the previous executive, and the summary of the discussion on the executive used precisely the same words. Now, it's economy, but it indicates that that position is really the position of the NTEU, and it's going to take a lot of work, which I'll come to soon, a lot of work to change that. And I place in the context that there is not a huge amount of support for BDS among Australian unions, whereas there's quite a lot of support overseas. Now, the opponents of BDS sought to portray the issue as beyond the purview of unions' work, an abstract proposition. Oh, this is a quotation from Nick. Opponents of BDS at the National Council sought to portray it as an issue beyond the purview of the union's work, an abstract proposition lacking concrete proposals for implementation. This is hardly an argument against it. Even a symbolic move adopting pro-BDS policy would be a significant gesture in support of the Palestinians and so on. Now, this letter was written by Nick Reamer to Michael Spence, the Vice-Chancellor here, and for reasons I don't understand, he didn't come. He was invited here, and this was in the letter. Now, there is a story about BDS at Sydney University, which some of you will know, which I'm going to deal with now. First, it's to do with Jake Lynch. Now, I'm not going to go into great details about that. But not long after this, terribly long after this debate within the National Council of the Union, Jake Lynch was charged with misconduct arising out of a pro-Israeli meeting, which he mentioned this morning. And he had been previously taken to federal court by a Jewish Zionist organisation. That was going on. And then this pro-Israel meeting was on. He went, and there were all sorts of accusations. He was charged with misconduct. And he was found not guilty. So, you know, the issue was raised by Jake being a sort of unwilling martyr at Sydney University. So that, among his support people, were a number of people in the branch executive of Sydney University who supported the position he was taking. There was, I understand, quite a division on the branch executive about the matter. And a decision was made to talk about the issue. And at that point, McCulloch interviewed and sent this individually to all members. Time when universities and trade unions are under siege from the Abbott government, which is true. An NTU branch is as important as Sydney University, and it is the biggest branch, and in some ways the most active branch in union, cannot afford the division and fruitless procedural wrangling that had been generated by this ill-conceived general meeting. Now, senior officers of unions interfere in local activities all the time, but this was a very, very public intervention designed not only to convince the members, but to flag more generally that the union wants to leave this alone. The meeting was held and the decision was about whether the branch would talk about BDS, not whether they supported it, whether they talk about it. And they voted 68 to 56, which indicates pretty equal division in the membership about discussing BDS. Now, as an outsider to all this, I can't see the problem about discussing something, but obviously other people thought that once you discuss these things, you're moving inexorably to taking a position on them, and that was the concern. Some of the reasons for the NTU position, I can't prove this, but McCulloch himself was a part of the AUS, very influential member of the AUS executive when all that stuff about Palestine, supporting Palestine, went on, I think in the 1980s. And there were a number of other people who worked for the NTU, and it's a part of their folk memory. Let's not go near that ever again. I think that's not the most important reason, but I suspect among influential senior people, that's still in the back of their head. You know, it effectively tore the AUS apart. We don't want to do that to NTU. More importantly, there is the fear of rousing members to organise any commitment against Palestine and BDS, and not for members, but also, and probably more importantly, to rouse others like the Australian Jewish Time and media such as The Spectator and The Australian, who tend to give fairly close attention to NTU activities, particularly in relation, but not exclusively, to this issue. The most important reason was given that since 1993, most unions and the NTU have been involved in almost continuous bargaining. And there are times where almost the whole resources of the union are focused on that, particularly when there's a dispute in a particular site. And there is an argument to say, well, Bargaining's the number one priority. Let's not muddy the waters. So what is to be done? Organising inside the NTU through branches and divisions has not had much success hitherto, given what happened at Sydney University. That's not an argument for doing it. It's just saying it hasn't worked so far. It may be better for people, and this is really people at Sydney University, to make informal contact with other NTU members to raise the matter carefully in their branches. But crucially, I think, and this conference is clearly a part of that, the organisation outside the NTU by NTU members and allies can get this on the union agenda, but it might take a while. And finally, we know the horrors of what's going in Palestine. The tide is turning in terms of public interest in the issue and support for Palestine, and it's largely because of the Israeli actions. And indeed, very recently, internal debate in the ALP, which is largely based on certain demographic facts. So that's what I see as an observer of where to go. But just to protect myself, I've said it all may be in the realm of Pollyanna, but if we took that view about any issue, we'd never do it. Thank you.
Hi everyone. The Maritime Union supports the rights and struggles of the Palestinian people against occupation, state-sponsored terror, oppression and a racist apartheid state. Our predecessor unions, the Waterside Workers Federation and the Seamen's Union of Australia, also held strong pro-Palestinian positions. And we congratulate the organisers and the participants of this important conference for the work you do in building support and solidarity for the struggle of the Palestinian people. Boycott, divestment and sanctions is a form of struggle. And for Palestinians and their many supporters worldwide, a legitimate form of struggle against Israeli occupation, colonialism and apartheid. BDS is an effective form of solidarity activity that can bring about a potential mass engagement. It is huge in scope and opens a wide range of potential targets and actions for solidarity and economic pressure against the actions of a rogue state. But like any form of struggle, it is important to build and popularise the reasons, benefits and potential outcomes of a BDS campaign. Accordingly, a main task is to build a broad base, particularly amongst the working class, of support for the goals and principles of the Palestinian solidarity movement. BDS is a higher form of campaigning and needs to be understood and supported to meet the level of mass engagement where the movement would have an economic and consequential political impact. Ultimately, when dealing with workers, the main issues need to be explained. We need to overcome racist stereotyping and a generation of Islamophobic fear. The struggle for a Palestinian state, an end to occupation, opposition to apartheid Israel, the need to tear down the wall, and a return of refugees back to Palestine all need to be tackled to achieve the basis for commitment to BDS actions. The MUA has a long and proud history of solidarity boycotts, albeit in a different political and industrial environment. The long-standing oil embargo of South Africa, particularly by the Seamen's Union of Australia, as has just been mentioned, gained international attention and the praise of comrades such as Nelson Mandela for its effectiveness. Boycotts and bans on pig iron to Japan in the 1930s and boycotts and post-World War II bans on Dutch shipping in support of Indonesian independence were very effective. But many unionists and union leaders fear or are wary of BDS, while at the same time advocating support for Palestinian solidarity. Now, this should be seen as an opportunity. Many have grave and in some cases somewhat justifiable fears of the consequences of unprotected industrial activity and massive fines and damages that are placed at the feet of unions who engage in legitimate but ultimately unlawful struggle. And BDS is too often seen by unionists as a call for unions to take action and be exposed alone, which today can be an existential threat and impacts upon the level of engagement from unions. And union participation in BDS campaigning for some is simply about workers stopping Israeli cargoes. Now, that in itself is a considerably complex exercise, as Zim Shipping Line does not even have an office in Australia, and any Israeli cargoes are all masked through Asian hub ports. And the current reality is the objective practical processes of boycotting Israeli cargoes is near impossible. Now, this is largely due to the difficulty of identification, plus subjective factors are not at a level where they need to be for an industrial BDS campaign to be effective or be supported yet by workers who are fundamental to its success. The social balance of class forces and reactionary anti-union laws would guarantee a much different response from bosses today to the historical Indonesian, Japanese, and South African responses. And these are realities which must be understood if this campaign is to be developed amongst unions. That is why it's so important also to support the ACTU's Change the Rules campaign. The ability of the union movement and workers to eradicate the unfair Fair Work Act is absolutely essential. And to talk about opening up new possibilities in struggle for fundamental rights, such as a right to strike, can only lead to more effective solidarity potential from unions. BDS and broader questions of Palestinian solidarity need to be raised together. Various forms of BDS action need to be outlined, and unions must be encouraged to act in these social campaigns. And this requires targets. And the targets should not be random, but part of a controlled and organised approach that allows the development and popularisation of the movement. This could be retail outlets, brand names, products, where there is already a comprehensive list, but not coordinated action. Unions and unionists need to be and can be engaged in these social struggles, and the growth and strength of social movements allows the solidarity actions to grow and eventually return to the workplace. The last speaker made a quite interesting point in the very opening of his contribution, in that what sticks in his mind most about BDS, and that was everyone going and sticking up a coffee shop. I mean, action. And in both instances, references to action. And they're the things that, unfortunately, I think are somewhat lacking at the moment. A simple silver bullet of wharfies banning Israeli cargo won't succeed in the current political and industrial climate. And it shouldn't be lost on anyone that the anti-worker, anti-union, politically conservative forces are the identical class enemies that continually advocate Israel as being a bastion of peace and democracy. So the struggles of working people in Australia and for an end to occupation and justice in Palestine are linked, as are all struggles against the domination of imperialism and capital. We need to draw the links with all the movements and streams of struggle, fighting imperialist aggression and capitalist economic and political hegemony. Solidarity is always easier to promote with a shared oppressor, and when victims recognise they are on the same side in the same struggle. Recently, our union has had youth activists visit Palestine in a union delegation. The visit of the young comrades was used as a basis of popularising and getting the message out about the incredibly inhumane oppression suffered by the Palestinian people under the occupation. Our union's been in the forefront of international trade union delegations to Palestine, all aimed at allowing us to bring the truth back home, to bring the struggle of the Palestinian people back home, as well as to inject solidarity and support to our comrades in struggle. We've been a force advocating strong engagement around Palestine within international trade union forums. And the last speaker explained the complexity of international trade unionism, and it is very complex and very divided in so many different ways, geographically and ideologically in many respects. Our union is also in favour of hosting any comrades who are able to articulate a position on this struggle, who will be playing a positive role in the BDS or Palestinian Solidarity movement. And to this end, the union will make sure that visitors gain entry to the waterfront, speak to workers and prosecute a case. Visits by people in struggle are received well by maritime workers. It's always an opportunity, so it's an opportunity that I urge anyone involved here to contact us if that sort of opportunity does arrive, because we can make the most of it. Job meetings serve multiple purposes. Workers take information home to family and friends. They discuss issues and contributions of visitors on the job. And the meetings link our class enemies at home and abroad. As almost always, the boss will have a different philosophical and political outlook to the visitors that we host. While BDS campaigning presents wide-ranging opportunities in the movement is largely being confined to academia and philosophical discussion. BDS needs an activist agenda. It needs targeted campaigns that people can be asked to join and support. For unions, that could take the form of work within superannuation funds, pushing and lobbying for divestment of super funds that have Israeli-based investments. And if they do, there's a point of struggle. If they don't, there's a point of propaganda. But action is what will build the movement, and action is what is crucial ingredient required to bring the maximum number of people into the struggle. Boycotts are really hard to run. We've tried to run boycotts before, and it's so difficult. It's like a go-slow, almost impossible. If left alone, for people to express their will and choice on a list of non-compliant businesses, nothing will happen. And boycotts need to be underpinned by a whole raft of organised campaign activity, stunts, mass action, something that gains the spotlight and extends the capacity to talk about boycotting if they're organised. Our union has activist committees, and consistent with these union policy on this question, these committees support the Palestinian people in their struggles. Many officials of the MUA are supporters of the Palestinian people, and there is much opportunity for the movement to draw on the commitment and policy positions of unions like the MUA. And with this in mind, the aim of extending union influence in this struggle, it may be of value for the BDS movement to consider basic information packs outlining historical struggle, the nature of the occupation, and how workers and unions can assist and be part of a campaign. Despite its intellectual rigour, the movement will not grow without coordinated actions and a broader campaign strategy that takes BDS and Palestinian solidarity into the community, into the workplace, with a communication strategy, and engages as many political allies as possible in the broadest solidarity front possible. Comrades, we're up for that task, and the MUA will be on that journey with you people all the way. Thanks very much, comrades.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to speak. The important thing I think we want to do is, and particularly for people in New South Wales, because I think people in other states were not aware of the tremendous outburst of media fury that descended upon the Greens via the Greens resolution on BDS, that's the Greens New South Wales resolution, and in particular the decisions by Marrickville Council. I must say, to sort of put up our hands and incriminate ourselves at the beginning, I proposed the Greens New South Wales BDS resolution, and Cathy proposed the Marrickville Council resolution. So we were, in effect, partners in crime. But what we want to do is to try to set the record straight, because up until this time, the record has been dominated by the media's deliberate falsification of what we were aiming for. And I think it's that media narrative that has dominated everything. And it's time, I think, as activists, for us to come out and say, no, that is wrong. The interpretation that is placed on events is wrong. And this is our version, at least.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the things we wanted to say was that context and looking at history and looking back at what happened, the context has to be clear. And I think there were some statements made yesterday, and unfortunately neither of us were in the room, but there was not the complete context. There were missing parts of the story. And I do think, you know, any historian has to try and look at all sides of the story and all parts of the jigsaw. So hopefully we can fill in some of those dots there today.
Yes, but can I also make a point about the Greens? The Greens are essentially a confederation of state parties. And in terms of policy development, whilst at the national level we would agree upon particular policies, and there is the understanding that none of the states will promote policies that contravene or are in opposition to the national approach. It is perfectly legitimate from the state perspective to develop upon and extend existing policies. And that, I think, is one of the things that New South Wales in particular has tried to do in many respects.
Look, I wanted to just also say that in terms of the Greens' four policies which underpin, or four pillars which underpin the policies, peace and non-violence is a big one, as is democracy and social justice. So out of those pillars come a lot of the policies that you know so well. And there was a history, and there is a history of the Greens of standing up for justice for minority groups such as the Tibetans, such as the West Papuans, such as the Palestinians. This is not new, and it's also not new for the Greens to have policies that other people might find, you know, lead inevitably to failure. I mean, we're well aware of that, but that hasn't stopped the Greens on a national or state level ever pursuing policies that we believe are the right policies to have. So it's not a matter of this is going to be an unsuccessful policy. I mean, look at the drugs policy, for example, which we've had for many, many years, you know, and has caused great outcry. So underpinning all our policies is a desire for social justice and for peace and non-violence. So I'm just going to look at a resolution from 2010, which actually is one that most people haven't heard about, but the ACT Greens came up with a BDS proposal back in 2010. It went to the National Council, and there was a big debate about it. Now, you may see a lot of writing on the screen with some of these policies. We don't expect you to be reading all of it, just the highlighted bits are the bits that we want to focus on. So as a result of the ACT Greens National Council resolution, the Greens came up with their 2010 resolution, which basically includes a military boycott and sanctions. This is a current policy, and it has led some of the work that New South Wales has done since then.
Turning specifically to New South Wales, what happened is that in August, I'd returned from a feeder tour to both Palestine and the West Bank and to Gaza, and had seen the aftermath of Operation Cast Lead. And I'd also had the opportunity to meet the leaders of the BDS campaign within Palestine. So I came back determined that New South Wales should have the opportunity to specifically address this. And the way we do it through the Greens is that in New South Wales we have a local group. Proposals come from a local group. If they're agreed to, they are then sent to the State Delegates Council, which is comprised of delegates of all the local groups from across the state. They discuss it, and they can either adopt it, reject it, or if there is any dissent, it can often be sent off to a working group to look at the issues in detail and to report back. So I think it was October 2010, the local group I belong to, we had this very detailed, relatively detailed proposal, Well, the proposal was itself was smaller, but the background attempted, because there was a recognition that a lot of people may not be familiar with the issues, but it for example, canvassed the numbers of unions, both nationally and internationally, that were supporting it. It talked about the South African boycott and the anti-apartheid campaign. It referred to a National Council of Churches in Australia 2010 statement that added its voice to the call for an end to Israel's occupation of Palestine. And in solidarity with Palestinian Christians, it asked its member churches and wider Australian community to consider a boycott of goods produced by Israeli settlements. Then we talked about the UN General Assembly and varying questions that the Greens had put to the Minister of Defence about Australian military deals with Israel, and acknowledged the original ACT Greens, and then mentioned the siege of Gaza, the attack on the flotilla, right, the usual stuff. So we want to make it perfectly clear the political background to which this resolution was coming. So it went to a meeting of the State Delegates Council in Sydney, and the Sydney meetings, even though the council meetings rotate around the state, the Sydney meetings are always the biggest. There is no question that the proponents of BDS and the supporters of Palestine went there prepared to argue as strongly as they could why this was an appropriate way to proceed. And we were all surprised. There was no opposition whatsoever. No one spoke, and which meant that because we could only have a couple of people speaking for it and no one against it, the discussion was cut short. Just couldn't be developed. Nor was there any suggestion that it should be sent to a working group so that there was a chance to examine more in detail and to inform the members. Which was what would normally happen. Yeah, which was a contentious policy. That was what was normally happen. So it went through, right? And so we were in a consensus position. But at the same State Delegates Council meeting, there was also a report on the forthcoming state election in March. This was December 2010. March 2011 was the state election. And so, at that same SDC, the two issues were discussed, but no one connected the two. There was no expectation that, in fact, this policy on the BDS would impact on the state election. We may have been naive. It might be possible now to look back after the event and say, well, that was very, very stupid, but that was the case. Because we found in the past, for example, that our positions, you put them out there, but they can be ignored by the media totally, and so it was in that context that both of those decisions went ahead. And when we look at the amount of money that it was determined at that council meeting would be spent on the two electorates where we thought we had the best chance, everybody's money was on Balmain. And in fact, Marrickville, we thought we might have a chance, but we really didn't expect to win it. And this was reflected in the fact that the amount of money allocated to Marrickville was 25% less than that was allocated to the Balmain campaign. So it was in this context that we existed, as it were, in happy ignorance up until, I think, the 13th of January 2011, when the Daily Telegraph came out with a story on the BDS decision, and then the very next day, Anthony Albanese's piece came out.
We'll get to that.
And we'll get to that, but that was the start of the onslaught.
I think that point that Sylvia made about the allocation of funds is also opposite to the post-state election media, claims that Marrickville was a dead certainty and definitely we would have won it if it hadn't been for the BDS. In fact, the facts are very, very different, and Marrickville was the best performing of any state seat in the whole of the New South Wales election. So we're very proud of that. The background to the Marrickville BDS motion was that Marrickville had a number of forces, a number of conditions, I guess, that meant the ground was very ripe for a BDS motion to go forward and to be supported, by and large, by all the Labor Party members and all the Greens. There was an existing Burma clause in documents at Marrickville Council, all based around ethical procurement, which meant that if Marrickville was tendering or taking tenders from any company who had any associations with the Burmese military government, then these had to be made clear and these would be weighted against that tender. That had gone through in the previous council. I think that had been standing, I think, from well before 2007, even earlier than that, in fact, because the sister city relationship with Bethlehem started in 2007. There are a number, Arabic is one of the four most popular languages spoken in the electorate of Marrickville, and a lot of the councillors, including the Labor councillors, had strong connections in the Arabic community, and particularly with Palestinians, hence the sister city relationship with Bethlehem. Across the Parramatta Road, we have the Balmain Council, who had also a sister city relationship with the West Bank town, Friends of Hebron, or Hebron. So there was a lot of cross-pollination there between the two councils around some of these issues. Marrickville had seen visits from the Mayor of Bethlehem. In fact, the Mayor had visited before I was on council in 2008. So I was councillor from 2008 to 2012. The Mayor of Bethlehem had been there, I think, in 2007, signing the sister city relationship with Bethlehem at that time. We'd also had visits from representatives from the university in Bethlehem, the Catholic Christian University. Father John Bray, I don't know, Peter Bray, I think it was, who came at least twice to Marrickville. He was hosted by the council and he spoke a lot about the situation there. In fact, I was quite amazed by him, a very impressive man, a New Zealander who'd never travelled out of New Zealand until he took up a vice-chancellorship at Bethlehem University. He came and spoke in Marrickville at the Marrickville Council, and he talked about summary executions on the streets of Bethlehem where he lost two of his students. I was, quite impressed with the man and his openness to speak of such things in such a gathering. In 2009, myself and the Labor councillor Mary O'Sullivan put forward a Gaza motion. We were appalled and shocked, as the rest of the thinking world was, by what was happening in Gaza, and that's the motion that went forward. It was voted for by all except the independent councillors. There was no issue with it. All of Labor and all of the Greens supported this motion, and the media didn't particularly pick it up. I think one journalist did and said that, Hamas had some allies in the inner West Bank of Sydney, which we thought was great. We, subsequently call ourselves the inner West Bank of Sydney. So that was the Gaza motion. This is the December 2010 BDS motion that went up, and it was supported by 10 of the 12 councillors. The only two against the motion were the independent councillors, Victor Macri and Morris Hanna. We had discussions within our council group about this before the motion went forward, and so did the Labor Party. There was a strong feeling of solidarity at this time with our friends in Bethlehem and with our community groups in the Marrickville municipality. It was contentious, yes, and we understood that it was the first time a council in Australia was taking a stand such as this, but it certainly wasn't the first time that councils worldwide had. And in fact, I would say that the councils in the UK and in Europe and some in America have been the driving forces behind some of the largest BDS successes that we've seen to date. And so it was in that spirit of trying to bring Australia into the forefront and also to show solidarity that Marrickville looked at this basically in terms of an ethical procurement policy. So looking at how the council could look at what goods and services it was procuring to do that in an ethical manner. None of this, by the way, was really reported in the media. Any of you who are aware of the media frenzy, and we'll go on to that in a minute, will see the way that this was interpreted.
No, I was just going to say, at that same council meeting, there was a mayoral minute from the Greens Mayor, Fiona Byrne, saying that council should support same-sex marriage, right? Came out, supported, the council supported it. That point was never made in all the discussion about council should stick to its knitting, it should
gutters.
It's roads, rates and rubbish. That was council's purview, that it was completely overreaching itself when it dared to comment on national or international events. And yet the motion that was supported by the council on same-sex marriage attracted not one jot of interest until even after the election.
Oh, just a couple of photos. I mean, in my experience on council in the 4 years, the Marrickville meetings around the BDS were the largest I've ever seen in any council meeting anywhere. The two main rooms were completely full. People were down the stairs and on the street. They had to put loudspeakers in other rooms so that people could hear. I mean, the community was engaged, and I can say that 99% of the community were in support. Marrickville councillors received support from all around the world and from all around Australia to support their stance. It was overwhelming. Of course, there was a lot of opposition from the lobby, and we took that, knowing that that was coming and it was going to happen and it would be coordinated, and it was. I think the political context of the Marrickville BDS motion is really what turned the mainstream media onto this issue and turned it into what became an utter circus.
Yes. I think I mentioned before that Anthony Albanese led the charge. At no stage did Anthony reveal that his wife, Carmel Tabbert, was in fact the Labor candidate for the seat of Marrickville. In fact, she was the Fiona Byrne's opponent, Fiona being the mayor who was running for the state seat. And Anthony led his piece. His title was, the piece in The Australian was, "Boycott of Israel is beyond the pale." Now, anyone who has any knowledge of Jewish history will know that the Pale of settlement was the area inside the fence where it was safe for Jews to exist, and also where their trade with the rest of the Russian society was inhibited. To go outside the Pale was to subject yourself to potential attack. This was dog whistling at its worst, because it suggested, in fact, that the proponents of BDS were basically anti-Semitic and just intensely anti-Jewish. So that led the attack. Now, from there on in, we got and from the state campaign point of view, with the subsequent impact of the shock jocks, the editorial pieces, the general condemnation, the Green State Office being inundated. No, it wasn't inundated, but there were quite a few emails demanding answers to questions. And so I took on the job of responding to them. Totally waste of time. Talk about not changing anybody's mind. It was the usual questions about why aren't we taking action over China? Why are we so anti-Semitic? Don't we recognise that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East? You've got the whole repertoire. I'm sorry, I really regret my time spent, though it was an educative time. But the other thing that came out after the event, and this was revealed by Anthony Lowenstein on the 18th of July, 2012, and Anthony tweeted, he said, "Important background to the Marrickville BDS story." And quote, "An insider sent me the following information which provides essential understanding of the truth behind the BDS story. If you think politicians who embrace Israel are principled, think again." And this is the quote from the insider, who says, "Sadly, this is not really about the issue of Palestine and Israel or even the Greens political party. It's just more internal game playing by the right. A meeting of the Labor left in 2010, attended by Luke Foley, Anthony Albanese, Andrew Ferguson and others, actually endorsed the BDS against Israel unanimously. It wasn't until Albanese saw an opening for political opportunism that he flipped, started attacking the Greens party candidate Fiona Byrne and putting heavy pressure on his own Marrickville councillors, particularly Mary O'Sullivan and Deputy Mayor Sam Iskander. And I must say, Mary O'Sullivan had been on the tour to Palestine with me. Anyway, he said, Iskander, Albanese's main numbers man, was holding firm under an immense amount of pressure to back down. The real crunch was when the Greens Party councillor Max Phillips publicly caved in and declared in the Sydney Morning Herald that he was now going to oppose the BDS. With no chance of the BDS remaining in place, Iskander was off the hook and voted against it on the floor of council. This was after the election.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. This screen, it doesn't actually relate to that, but interestingly enough, so while there was so much, huffing and puffing in the media about the Greens, the ALP did not support Mitch Fifield's motion of March 2011, which condemned Marrickville. It also condemned Queensland branch of the ALP, which I forgot to mention, had moved their own BDS motion at their regional conference in 2010. So they were condemned in the Senate, and so were all these unions listed below. So everyone came in for a bit of it. This is what happened to Fiona Byrne. Most of you around Sydney may have seen this. This was all over the inner west. Stickers were put up. We actually caught some people putting the one up on the bottom here. Greens are against gay rights, against women's rights, against community tolerance. It was a doctor based in Newtown. His photograph was taken by some Greens who were out that night putting up their own corflutes, and he ended up in court and he had to plead guilty because this was not a properly authorised election poster. It was just an attack on the Greens. The Greens hate gays. The Greens support terror. That was another good one. And of course the Greens oppose democracy. So Marrickville was covered in this stuff leading up to the election. On the day before the election, there was an unsigned sheet put on every windscreen of every car in about 3 of the major suburbs around the Marrickville area. So the backlash was strong from certain elements within the lobby.
Marrickville's position on the BDS and its failure to win Marrickville was trumpeted as the ultimate repudiation of our policy, a complete failure that showed how abysmally incorrect the Greens were. But if you actually look at the results of that election, the Greens had 3 objectives that they set out in December 2010. 3 objectives for the seat for their election campaign. The first one was to maximise the chances of electing members of Parliament to the lower house of the New South Wales government. So the result was, the outcome, Balmain, we won. We won the seat of Balmain, and we won it with a 30.7% primary vote. Marrickville, we lost, but we achieved a 35.9% primary vote, the highest vote that the Greens Party had ever attracted at any election in Australia. And what's more, we thought we'd be lucky. We picked Balmain and Marrickville because we thought we might get above the 10% primary vote. In fact, across the state, we had 13 seats where we had a greater than 15% primary vote. So across the state, we couldn't be said that we had suffered. Our second objective was to elect a record number of Greens to the Legislative Council. We did that. We had 3 candidates elected, and that increased our numbers to 5 Greens representatives in the upper house. And our vote in the upper house across the state increased by 2% overall. The third objective was to increase the membership and support for the Greens as a political party. And the outcome was that the membership grew significantly throughout the campaign. In March, it was just over 3,000. It was the highest level ever obtained for the Greens in New South Wales, and in fact reflected a 10% increase. And we had approximately 3,500 Greens supporters staffing the polling booths. And can I say that the seat in the following election, even though there was a redistribution, and a lot of Marrickville became the seat of Newtown, we of course won that at the subsequent election, and Jenny Leong is the member there. So can I suggest to you that rather the BDS being portrayed as an absolute defeat of significant proportions, which is the way it was interpreted in the media, and unfortunately interpreted by sections of the Greens, it was in fact a very significant victory. A victory for people who look for substance rather than just swallow hook, line and sinker the media beat up, the media story, the media interpretation. And that, I think, is the significant thing. But the other significant thing about it is it was indicative of that division that runs through the Greens. Is it important to stick for policy and for a principled position, or is it more important to be pragmatic and popular? And believe me, if there's one thing that members of Parliament want, it's to be popular. Can I suggest to you that most party members, rank and file, regardless of which party they are in, they are more interested in policy. Thank you.